Thank you. I'd just like to thank MomsTEAM and everyone who's working with MomsTEAM for the opportunity to work with them with our pilot project, as well as putting on the summit. It's going to help in keeping our youth athletes safe, and I think we all really appreciate the work that MomsTEAM is doing with it. So today I'm going to talk about differences between males and females in regards to risk and concussion outcome. We know right now that the CDC estimates that there are approximately 1.6 to 3.8 million sport and recreational concussions reported each year in the United States. When we think of concussions, what do we think of? Male football players. In my case, I'm a Canadian, so I think of male ice hockey players. We know that it's constantly in the news for NFL, NHL players, boxers, lacrosse athletes. But did you know that females in sex-comparable sports has a greater increased risk of concussions? So this slide here represents data from the NCAA. This data is concussion injury rate, and an injury rate is the total number of concussions divided by the total number of athlete exposures, and this data is actually presented for 10,000 athlete exposures. You will notice here that for men's sports, if you look under football, the injury rate is 6.0. But then if you go over to the women's column, there are 3 sports that have a slightly higher increased injury rate than football: women's ice hockey, women's soccer, women's lacrosse. So these are all 3 sports that actually have a slightly higher rate compared to male athletes. When you then look at sex-comparable sports, so what exactly are those? Sports that are played with similar rules, similar environment. Your soccer, basketball, softball compared to baseball. And if we look again at soccer, you will notice that female concussion injury rate is 6.7. If you look over at males, it's 4.2. If you look at lacrosse, pretty equal, 6.2 for females to 6.0 for males. But then if we look at basketball, females are at 4.8 compared to males who are at 3.4. So the data is starting to show that at the NCAA level in sex-comparable sports, females have a higher risk for a concussion. When we consider high school athletes, so more of your youth athletes, not below the high school age, but just high school adolescent age, there have been several studies that have also found that females in sex-comparable sports are almost at a 2 times greater risk for a concussion compared to male athletes in those 3 sports: soccer, basketball, and softball. This was a study done by Lincoln and colleagues that was published in 2011 in American Journal of Sports Medicine. And what they did was they looked at sports, high school sports, over a 10-year period. And they wanted to see what were the sports that were on the rise for concussions. The highest sport is wrestling. So wrestling athletes had a 27% increase in their concussions over the 10-year period. 10-year period was from 1997-98 to 2008. But if you notice the girls' sports, every single one of those sports were tied, equal, or higher increase for concussions over that 10-year period. Cheerleading was the highest female sport at 26%. We know that cheerleaders are doing more dangerous stunts, more dangerous tumbling or pyramids, and unfortunately they're falling, hitting their heads, or they're going down in their stunts and hitting the person on the base with their elbow, resulting in concussions. So they actually increased by 26% over a 10-year period. But then if you look at basketball, girls increased by 24%. It's pretty high for girls compared to males who are at 17%. Softball, 23%. We're starting to see a lot more concussions in your softball athletes compared to your baseball athletes. And again, soccer and lacrosse, we're at 17%. So why exactly do we think females might be at a greater risk for a concussion? There are several different possibilities. One potentially is due to the fact that females have weaker neck muscles. We have less neck girth, so around our neck is less. Head-neck segment is also less. But what they also found in females is they have a greater peak angular acceleration. So females tend to turn their heads faster. And because of that increased rotation at the neck, it may possibly be predisposing them to concussions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about now what happens after that athlete gets a concussion. Well, we know that obviously they will display signs and symptoms of a concussion. However, you need to also know that those symptoms may not immediately appear in that concussed athlete. So you might see an athlete take a hit in football, in basketball, go up to head a ball in soccer. You may actually evaluate them for a concussion, and they don't exhibit any of these signs and symptoms, or they just lie to you. But you need to be careful, because what we're finding right now is that sometimes these symptoms might appear within 24 to 48 hours. So just because you've evaluated the athlete on the field and you're going to remove them from play because you suspected a concussion, so you always have to remove that athlete from play for that day, you need to go and reassess the athlete the next day and the day following that to make sure they truly did not incur a concussion. In the past, 20 years ago, we thought loss of consciousness. You had to have it. You had to see the person unconscious on the field, blackout, for them to have a concussion. We now know that research shows less than 9% of all concussed athletes have loss of consciousness. We need to make sure that parents and coaches and youth athletes understand this. It's not about them seeing the athlete lying down unconscious on the field. That's not what we're supposed to be looking for with a concussed athlete, as less than 9% it's going to be exhibited in that athlete. We know that some of the signs and symptoms are headaches, confusion. We might see balance problems, vestibular problems. They might have difficulty remembering plays before or after their concussion. They might have difficulties in sleep, so they may have trouble falling asleep, sleeping more or less than usual. But they also might have some behavioral issues, so they might be more emotional. They might display signs of sadness, even some signs of depression. So we need to be aware of all of these signs and symptoms of a concussion with these youth athletes. When we consider differences for males and females after a concussion, what do we know? Several studies have found female athletes tend to report more total number of concussion symptoms. So when we ask them all their signs and symptoms, they tend to report more of those symptoms compared to male athletes. Now, we don't know if it's just that females are more honest in their reporting or if they truly exhibit more total concussion symptoms. When we do cognitive testing after the athlete has a concussion, several studies have found that females have worse visual memory performance. So we need to look out for some visual memory declines. We also have found that some female athletes have showed a slower reaction time compared to male athletes. This could be a problem for the female athletes. Having a slower reaction time could predispose them to another injury. So we need to be very careful with these athletes. So we know that we're starting to see some differences in what is presented following the concussion in your female athletes. One study actually found that female athletes were 1.7 times cognitively more impaired than male athletes. So this is something that we need to be aware of when we are working with athletes and when we are talking to parents. When we consider concussion management, we know now that we do a multifaceted approach to concussion management. We take a good clinical exam with a good clinical history. One of the things about a clinical history, it's not just about how many concussions have you had. I had one. And then leave it there. That's not good enough. We need to know, what was the severity of your symptoms? How long did your symptoms last? We need to ask them questions to see maybe if they've had other concussions and didn't realize it. Did you have any facial injuries? Yeah, I had an orbital blow-up fracture, got an elbow to the eye, fractured it. Of course we're concerned about the eye. We didn't think about the concussion. So we need to find out, were there facial injuries that may have actually resulted in a concussion, but we were more concerned about other injuries than that concussion? Did they have a neck injury that might have resulted in a concussion? We also need to ask them not only about their sport, especially when you talk to athletes. Everything is about the sport they're currently playing, because they can't think about anything else. If they're playing basketball, it's only basketball. They don't think about when they're going to play baseball. They don't think about other sports. So we need to ask them, did you have a concussion in another sport? Did you have a concussion not playing sports? Did you fall off your bike? Did you fall off your skateboard? Were you in a car accident? Some of these things, when you ask the athlete and the parent, kind of brings up, oh yeah, I did. I was in a car accident and he had a concussion 4 years ago. But they don't think about it because you're talking about the athlete who's playing a sport. So we need to make sure when we do concussion management that we actually take a very good clinical history exam and a good previous history of concussions. We know now that we should do balance and vestibular testing. We know that we should also do some type of cognitive testing, and we should never return the athlete back to play when they are not ready, and do some type of a return to play criteria rather than just putting them right back into their sport. One of the things we try to do is educate athletes. We try to educate athletes on the signs and symptoms of concussions and the seriousness. At Michigan State University, we try to go out to the community and we try to give talks to parents and athletes and coaches. And a few years ago, I was giving a talk, girls volleyball players. Thought it was going well, until the father raised his hand and said, Tracy, do you know you're talking to my daughter who plays volleyball and not my son who plays football? I said, yes, I'm aware of that. Yes. Well, she's not going to get a concussion. So why are you talking to us? So I had to explain to these parents that, yes, your daughter plays volleyball, and yes, it's not at one of those sports that are at a higher risk for a concussion. However, females do sustain concussions. And does your daughter play basketball? Yes. Well, guess what? Your daughter's going to be at a greater risk for a concussion than your son when he plays basketball. So we need to educate not only the athletes, but the parents and the coaches, because a lot of them only think that concussions happen in football. They don't understand that concussions happen in all these other sports, even volleyball. When I was talking to some of these coaches and the athletes and the players, I was like, have you guys ever dove for a ball and hit each other in the head? They're like, yes. Did you ever dive and hit the pool? Yes. Is their skill that good? Probably not. So because of that, they are predisposed to these concussions. So we need to be careful when we're educating people that it's not all about your football players, that we're educating everyone on the signs and symptoms of concussions, as well as the dangers of playing with concussion. So I was privileged enough last year to be part of the IOM committee that studied sport-related concussion in sport. And one of the biggest things that came out of this was changing the culture. We know that in 2004, there was a study that was done that looked at high school football athletes and their reporting of concussion. 44 athletes didn't report a concussion because they didn't want to come out of the game. 66% of them didn't report it because they didn't think it was serious enough. 10 years later, research shows that these athletes now, they are more knowledgeable. They now know the signs and symptoms of concussions. They know it's a serious injury. They shouldn't be playing with it. But then when they were asked, will you still continue to play? They said yes. Do you think it's okay to play with a concussion? They said yes. So even though we're increasing the knowledge of concussion in athletes, we haven't changed the behavior. We haven't changed the culture. We need to find a way to change the culture so athletes do not continue to play through their concussion. They don't think that being tough and playing through their concussion for their team is the best thing to do. We need to change the culture so that they understand that it is a serious injury, that it's not okay to play through it. It's not smart for an athlete to play through their concussion. And through MomsTEAM and SmartTeam, that's one of the things that we're trying to do. We're trying to make smart teams. We're trying to make smart athletes, and we're trying to make smart parents. We're trying to explain to these individuals, smart players don't play through concussions. They don't play through the pain because they risk further serious injury. And it's up to all of us to change the culture and to make youth sports safer. Thank you.